Welcome. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Packers make it official on Monday. They release veteran cornerback Jaire Alexander. Really a hell of a roller coaster ride throughout the offseason, dating back quite literally a day or two after the loss to Philadelphia in January on Wild Card Weekend. And we see the saga come to a conclusion. I know some Packer fans are upset that Jaire was released. Packers didn't trade him. Sounded like reports had surfaced that there was a deal in place maybe with Buffalo earlier in the offseason, but it kind of circulated around the premise of Jaire restructuring his contract with the Bills. He wasn't open to doing that. Green Bay offered him a restructure. That never came to fruition. He and his team, he being Alexander, obviously didn't want to accept the restructure. So he's going to hit free agency for the first time in his career, and his time as a Green Bay Packer has concluded. There's a lot of different angles to this. I'm trying to figure out where we want to start. You go back to January, because I mentioned it's a roller coaster ride. You go back to January, and Jaire Alexander said at Locker Cleanout Day, a couple days after the loss to Philly, that he, quote, he said he had nothing to say to the media because he didn't know if he was even going to be back next year, meaning this year, with Green Bay. And then Goody gives a presser to the media shortly after the loss to Philadelphia, again, a couple days afterwards. And he said some interesting things about Jaire. He mentioned financially they could bring him back for this season, and that was true. Even without restructuring the deal, they could, financially afford to bring Jaire back, and they didn't have to create space to do that. He mentioned the missed games, and that's what this all boils down to. There was no beating around the bush with what the crux of the issue was with Jaire Alexander. There were little blips on the radar here and there. You remember when he ran out for the coin toss in Carolina when he wasn't a captain? Very outspoken throughout his tenure in Green Bay. Wasn't afraid to speak up when he was frustrated with things. And so there were little blips on the radar, but his release had nothing to do with any of those things, and it had to do with his availability. Talking about a guy who in each of the last 2 years has played a grand total of 7 games in each of the last 2 seasons and 34 of the last 68 regular season games across 4 years. And you're paying top dollar. You're paying top of the market for a premier cornerback because when he's on the field, he still is a top cornerback, one of the best in the business. But availability was the problem. And Goody mentioned it. Mark Murphy referenced it earlier today, and I'm recording this on Monday, a few hours after the release. And a lot of times, whether it's, team president, general manager, coaches, even you hear the term player speak. Like if there's an issue that pops up, they might push it to the side by deflecting or bringing up something else, maybe as like being the root of it, when really we all know that it's not. With Jaire's situation, like it dates back to January with Goody talking about the availability. And he made some interesting comments after that loss to Philadelphia. Goody did, bringing up like it's frustrating for the player, Goody said. But then he noted it's also just as frustrating for the organization. And so you kind of knew like things are on rocky ground. And as the offseason carried on, you talk about the combine and then owners' meetings at the end of March. And Goody talked openly about the Packers potentially trading Jaire Alexander and how they wanted value back if they were giving up a player of his caliber. And so really January to like April up until the draft, it seemed like a foregone conclusion, right? Like the writing was on the wall. Jaire Alexander's not going to be back with the Packers. And then the draft comes and goes, and Green Bay doesn't address the position outside of taking Tulane's Micah Robinson all the way in the 7th round. And so you're starting to wonder, they signed Nate Hobbs in the offseason, and really I think the signing of Hobbs was also an indicator at the time, like, hey, Green Bay's probably moving on from Jaire Alexander. And then the draft comes and goes, and it's kind of silent on all fronts. And then reports start surfacing like, hey, the Packers might be open to finding a compromise in this situation and reconciling their differences with Jaire Alexander and finding common ground. And so all of a sudden you're starting to think, whoa, is Jaire actually going to stay in Green Bay? And then reports surface a couple weeks after that, or a few weeks after that, most recently that, hey, the Packers have offered Jaire a deal on a restructure on his contract to keep him in Green Bay for 2025. And I took the bait. At that time, I was like, I think Jaire's going to be back. And now we get the news Monday that they're going to release him. And so it's been a hell of a roller coaster ride with different pivot points. And really after the draft, I was like, they didn't address corner outside of the 7th round with the pick of Micah Robinson, and maybe he turns out to be good. Carrington Valentine is a starting caliber cornerback. He was taken in the 7th round, 2022, by Green Bay out of Kentucky. And so you might find another, gem, another diamond in the rough in the 7th round with Micah Robinson. Jury's still out on Kalen King, 7th round pick out of Penn State a year ago. I guess if you want to dive into that, I mentioned there's many different layers to this. The depth takes a pretty substantial hit. I don't think anyone can convince me otherwise on that. The idea of having Keyshawn Nixon and Nate Hobbs as your 2 and 3 on the depth chart is a lot more appealing to the eye than having them as your 1 and 2. Now, that's not to say that neither Hobbs or Nixon could be a true number 1 corner, but when you're talking about the duration of a 17-game season, and I'll pull it up. I got to pull up the Packers schedule. You look at who Green Bay has on the docket this year in terms of wide receivers that they'll face. The depth takes a massive, and it sounds obvious, right? It just looks so much different without Jaire. Like, with him in the picture, Carrington Valentine's your 4th cornerback, and all of a sudden you're looking around and you're like, wow, Green Bay has an embarrassment of riches at corner. They have Jaire, they have Nixon, they signed Hobbs to a big deal. Carrington Valentine, you draft Micah Robinson, you have Kalen King, and all of a sudden you're forgetting completely that they lost Corey Ballantyne, who was here for 3 years, and Eric Stokes, who was a former first-round pick and went to Las Vegas in free agency. With Jaire out of the picture, all of a sudden you're like, we need Nixon or Hobbs, or maybe both, to take their game to another level. Again, you look at the schedule, the passing games, the wide receivers they're facing in 2025. Just look at the division alone. You get Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison twice. You get DJ Moore, Rome Odunze twice. You get Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams twice. That's 6 of your 17 games. And then elsewhere for Green Bay, week 2, week run right out of the gates, Nixon Hobbs. You're throwing them right into the fire against Detroit. Great passing offense. I know Ben Johnson's gone. I think Green Bay's getting Detroit at a good time. I mentioned that in a previous video a couple weeks ago. But Amon-Ra St. Brown's still awesome. Jamison Williams is still awesome. That's a hell of a duo, 1-2 punch at wide receiver for the Lions. Week 2, you get Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel, who Washington acquired in the offseason. And then you go down the line, like week 4, Dallas, you're like, oh, they have CeeDee Lambs. Yeah, they also traded for George Pickens. That's another 1-2 punch. Then you get your bye week 6 coming out of it. Arguably the best duo in the NFL, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. You have Marvin Harrison Jr. after that, DK Metcalf to follow. Week 10, Monday Night Football in Green Bay, A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. And we saw A.J. Brown really win that matchup in the playoffs consistently against Keyshawn Nixon a year ago. You get Malik Neighbors peppered in there. I mean, up and down the schedule. A lot of it, I think, speaks to the depth at wide receiver in the league. Like, a lot of teams have stars or superstars at wide receiver, but there's also teams who have 2. And I would say 2 of them are in your division. Detroit, like Jamison Williams would be a number 1 wide receiver on a lot of teams. Jordan Addison might be a number 1 on a few teams. But Justin Jefferson's arguably the best wide receiver in football. Amon-Ra St. Brown's a first-team All-Pro. You have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins you have to go up against. So it's not just like, and you can't just base it on 1 year on the schedule, but for all intents and purposes, the restructure for Jaire would have brought him back for 2025 and likely had him elsewhere in 2026. And so when you do look at the schedule, it's like, it's not just one really good wide receiver you're facing on a lot of weeks, it's 2. It's CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams. It's Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. It's Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel. Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. There's a lot of teams that are loaded at wide receiver with, like, top of the line, like, really, really good quality. And so I think you're asking, if you're Matt LaFleur, Goody, Jeff Hafley, the defensive coordinator, you're asking Nixon and Hobbs to elevate their game. You're not saying, hey, come back, be the same guys you were. You're saying, we need you to be a step better based on who we have and those offenses and those wide receivers that we're going to be facing this year. And secondarily to that, I mean, you can say this for like a lot of teams in a lot of positions, right? Like, man, if there's one injury, that depth could be completely shot. Like, it could look really bad. And so you could say it for a lot of teams in a lot of positions. But with Jaire out of the frame, if either of your top dogs go down in Keyshawn Nixon or Nate Hobbs, I love Carrington Valentine. And he, again, is a starting caliber cornerback, in my opinion. But you lose either Nixon or Hobbs for an extended period of time this year. And you can't really mentally prepare that way if you're a GM or a head coach, but I'm just throwing the idea out there. Hopefully it doesn't happen. But you lose one of those guys. Like the last couple of years you've been playing with Jaire only appearing in 14 total regular season games combined the last 2 years. And so Green Bay's had backup plans really in place, and it circulated around Keyshawn Nixon and Carrington Valentine getting an opportunity and stepping up, in little spots here and there for Eric Stokes last year and Corey Ballantyne, and you were able to piece it together, but Ballantyne's gone and Stokes is gone, and the Stokes thing was a foregone conclusion. I get that, and he didn't have a good 2024, and injuries really derailed his career up to this point, again, in my opinion. But you lose one of these top dogs this year at some point, all of a sudden you're certainly relying on 1 7th-round pick and likely 2, because behind Nixon and Hobbs are 3 7th-rounders in Valentine, Kalen King, and Micah Robinson. And so I believe things get a little more sketchy, a little more hairy there for Green Bay. You're banking in on Nixon and Hobbs to not only elevate their game, but to carry it through the duration of a 17-game regular season and then into the playoffs for you. I think for Packer fans, by the way, it's Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. Packers released Jaire Alexander on Monday. Financially, it's pretty cut and dry. I'm not going to drown you with numbers. Financially, this helps Green Bay out a lot. It just does. Like, there's dead cap hits of $7.5 million this year, $9.5 million next year, but Green Bay saves $17.1 million on the cap now, and then next year they save $17.5 million. And I know a lot of fans are frustrated because I'm going to tie two parts of this together: the financial part of it and some comments made by Goody back in January. Remember back in January after the loss to the Eagles, and Goody's pretty tightly wound with how he speaks. Like, Goody doesn't ever say too much that you're like, whoa, that's surprising. And back in January, he bluntly said, like, I think it's time we start competing for championships, which is the goal for every team, every franchise, every organization. But Goody was very direct. He's like, I think it's time we start competing for championships. He used the word urgency a couple of times, which, sprawled across headlines throughout news stories in the offseason. And it was just like, I loved that Goody was saying it, but it was somewhat out of character for him, a guy who usually doesn't say things so bluntly like that. He said, I think it's time to start competing for championships. And he used that word urgency, like they need to show urgency in doing so. Tying that in now with the financial part of this, Green Bay would have had to move nothing around to bring Jaire back this year. Nothing. Could have just brought him back. They offered the restructure as sort of like an ultimatum, and I get Green Bay's side of that. You don't want to pay top dollar for a guy who's been available for 50% of the games the last 4 years. That's crazy. So you offer the restructure, and Jaire and his team, his representation, have every single right to say no, and they did, and now he hits free agency. But Green Bay, theoretically, could have just sucked it up and said, you know what? We won't offer the restructure. We'll just bring him back at the cost we're paying him, and we'll cross our fingers that maybe this is the year he stays healthy, because 3 out of the last 4, it's been 4 games played, and then he did play 16 games 3 years ago, and then it was 7 and 7 each of the last 2. And so to me, when you have a GM who is speaking in terms of it's time we start competing for championships, I think frustration from some Packers fans, and I get it, stems from those comments and then releasing Jaire outright when financially you could have afforded to bring him back for 2025 with no harm done. Is releasing Jaire Alexander a move you make that says, hey, we're more ready now to compete for a championship? And I'm not going to sit here today and tell you, the release of Jaire Alexander shoots down any chance Green Bay has at really making a run through the NFC and trying to get to the Super Bowl. I don't even know where it's played at this year, but come February. I'm not suggesting that. You're hoping Jordan Love makes a year 3 starter leap. You're hoping Lucas Van Ness figures it out with heavy snap count totals this year in year 3. You're hoping guys can stay healthy like Kenny Clark, who had an issue in week 1, a foot issue, and never fully recovered. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of faith tied in with that as well. But no one could convince me that releasing Jaire Alexander is a move you make that backs up your statements in January about, hey, it's time we start competing for championships now. Again, I get it from the financial standpoint, but I think there is some frustration in certain pockets of the fan base when you make those comments and then you release your top cornerback and all anyone's talking about within it is, hey, man, look at Green Bay's, cap situation now for this year in 2026. There are some fans that are pretty fed up with, hey, look at these trades we've made the last few years to stock up future draft picks, and look at some of these cap cutting moves we've made to build up more cap space for 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And so I know some fans were probably upset Jaire gets released, and they don't want to hear about, hey, this saves Green Bay $17.1 million on the cap this year and $17.5 next year. And right now, after the release of Alexander, the Packers have the third most cap space with $46 million. And I've seen certain fans say, go get Trey Hendrickson now for Cincinnati. Reality is you could have traded for Trey Hendrickson and brought back Jaire Alexander and made it work. So I don't think there's correlation. I don't think the two are related. You release Jaire, now you're going to go all in on a guy like Trey Hendrickson, who's still upset in Cincinnati, and perhaps there's still a real need on the edge for Green Bay for those who don't believe in Van Ness making a significant leap, I think is the words Goody, or the phrase Goody used earlier this offseason. He expects a significant leap from Lucas Van Ness. So the Packers often seem to make moves that either financially, or if you're talking about acquiring draft picks, you look at like the trade of Rasul Douglas, and then they turn the season around and trading Devontae Adams, although he, kind of wanted out, and trading Rodgers. There's other moves tied in there too where they acquired and stocked up on draft picks. And, the emphasis is on like celebrating what you're getting 2-3 years down the road, whether it's financial flexibility, in this case with Jaire, or accumulating draft picks. And some fans are sick of that. And from that perspective, I get it, because, again, no one is convincing me releasing Jaire Alexander made the Packers better. It just didn't. Green Bay got to a point where they're like, we can afford to bring him back. We just don't want to bring him back at this price tag. And I think if you're using phrases like, hey, it's time we start competing for championships, sometimes you just got to suck it up and make a move that on paper is a bit risky and may not be the most financially sound. But again, it wasn't as though Green Bay had to make headway or they had to, move a ton of things around to fit Jaire financially into the equation. They could have just brought him back and rolled the dice a little bit on it. And they opted not to do that. And that's kind of how the Packers have operated for many years. And I think when you're talking about competing for championships right now, Jaire is a player that when he's on the field, he's helping you win right now. And I know the problem is availability, but yeah, that the move stinks to me from that aspect. It's hard to predict injuries, but I think you can predict with certain players that it's more likely or they're more susceptible to being bitten by the injury bug than others, and Jaire is certainly one of those guys. And I think there was also frustration last year from reports where it sounded like the Packers and their doctors thought Jaire was good to go in certain games and on certain occasions, and Jaire himself said, nah, I don't think I am. And I think that rubbed the Packers the wrong way, and that's fine. And I understand that side of it too. And I do get the financial angle of this, because if you want to, layer it out one more step further, Goody and the rest of the brain trust for the Packers did a great job in 2022? Let me go look. The Packers, was it 2020? It had to be 2022. The Packers hit on a lot of their picks that year. Yeah, 2022. Green Bay hit on a lot of their picks in 2022. And the good thing with that is you get value. You get, productive players on the field for you, like big-time puzzle pieces. The not good part of it, and it's just the nature of the beast, is you're going to have to hand over some significant paydays to some of those guys. And there are a lot of players from that 2022 class that are entering the final year of their contracts that many Packer fans, and I'm sure the Packers too, want to see stick around for the long haul. Quay Walker, as of right now, you had 2 first-round picks in 2022, Quay Walker and Devontae Wyatt. Green Bay earlier this offseason exercised Wyatt's 5th-year option. So you have Wyatt under contract for 2 more years. So there's a little more wiggle room there. But ideally, and Goody has mentioned this, you still want to get something done with Wyatt. He was the Packers' best pass rusher the first 4 weeks of the season last year before he got hurt and missed some time. He was a constant wrecking ball for Green Bay that first month of the season. Quay Walker's fifth-year option wasn't exercised, but that's because Goody had mentioned they want to keep Quay around for the long term, and it made you think like, okay, then an extension gets done this offseason. And then in the second and fourth round, you took 2 wide receivers, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. Right now, both are in contract years, final year of their deals. Are you bringing 1 back, 2 back, none of them back? Watson's injury and fact that he's going to miss significant time this upcoming season foggies his situation a little bit. You had 3 full-time starters on the offensive line a year ago come from that 2022 class. Your right guard, Sean Ryan, your right tackle, Zach Tom, and your left tackle, Rasheed Walker. Green Bay has since gone out, used premium picks on the offensive line. Jordan Morgan in the first round a year ago, Anthony Belton in the second round this past April. But you have 3 starters on your offensive line that, as of right now, are all entering contract years. They all have questions about their financial security, and are they even going to be in Green Bay past this season? And so the good is you hit on some of these guys in 2022, and that's awesome, and you always take that. You always sign up for that. You know you can't keep everyone around. The not-so-good part, again, is just, accepting it, that when you hit on a lot of picks from the same class, a lot of them are going to want hefty paydays, and you're not going to have enough money to divvy out. Well, for those who are in the camp of, hey, you get rid of Jaire, and now you have $46 million, the third most cap space at this current time. Green Bay is probably going to roll some of that over into next offseason, A, and B, the more likely route than making a deal for Trey Hendrickson and giving him an absurd but well-deserved extension that would probably make him the top-paid edge rusher in the NFL is looking at that list of guys who are entering the final year of their deals and start to give out extensions, again, well-earned, well-deserved ones, to guys you want to keep around. Zach Tom deserves an extension. Quay Walker, I thought, had his best year as a pro a year ago. Devontae Wyatt was so good the first month of the season, and I know it's just a month, but then he got hurt. And, at wide receiver, are you okay with losing both Watson or Doubs? You want to bring one of them back, both of them back? Those are decisions that have to be made, and releasing Jaire gives you that financial flexibility. Elton Jenkins, showing up this week to mandatory OTAs for the Packers is huge, but it sounds like he's not going to practice, and he wants a new deal, and he wants more financial stability and security moving from left guard to center, and recognizing the pay structure is not the same for those 2 positions. And Elton Jenkins should get a hefty payday if the Packers view him as a long-term puzzle piece. He's getting closer to 30, and we know the Packers usually shy away from that. So there's a lot more flexibility Green Bay has to dish out extensions to a lot of players. They just have so many quality players and so many starters that are entering the final year of their deals. And now you have the third most cap space by releasing Jaire. And so for those who are bringing up like, yeah, but at what cost do you cut ties with Jaire? I guess if you want to view it through more of an optimistic prism, you can start giving out extensions to Quay Walker if you want, Devontae Wyatt, Romeo Doubs, Zach Tom. Kingsley Enagbari is another name that can't be slept on. He's been a really productive piece on that defensive front for Green Bay and kind of an underrated part, playing more snaps than you would think, and sometimes goes underappreciated. Could be his last year. I know Green Bay took Barron Sorrell in the 4th round out of Texas. They took Oliver, who could be maybe an inside linebacker, edge hybrid out of Oklahoma State after taking Sorrell. But, yeah, there's a lot of names. And then you also have to factor in next year's class. Like, Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks next offseason will be in the same shoes, as of right now, that Doubs and Watson are in this year, entering the final year and wondering, am I in Green Bay for the long haul? Am I going to get an extension negotiated, or is there going to be open dialogue heading my way with my representation in the Green Bay Packers? So that part of it, I guess you could say, is good, but tough pill to swallow. I love Jaire. I love that his personality was just so different from kind of how the Packers typically do business, and I like that. I like when you have different voices, different personalities, and different presences in the locker room. And Jaire was so good at like pushing it right to the edge and sometimes maybe like tipping over the glass a little bit. I go back to that spot in Carolina where he wasn't a team captain and still ran out for the coin toss, and everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? But yeah, I think if you're set in your ways, and all the way back in January, you're talking about, hey, we're ready to compete for championships now, releasing Jaire Alexander, to me, not a move that indicates that. Although, again, I'm not saying Green Bay can't compete for a championship this year. I'm just saying it's a move that kind of goes against what your word was. So Green Bay's cornerback room takes shape now. It's going to be Nixon Hobbs as your 1-2. I would assume Bullard slides down to the slot. Carrington Valentine's your 3. Should get plenty of playing time. And then behind that, you've got Kalen King and Micah Robinson, perhaps duking it out for some depth spots. But, yeah, it's just the room looks a lot different. With Jaire in the frame, it's holy crap. This cornerback room's incredible. Like, the quality, the quantity, the depth, all of it. With him out of it, it's like you're really, really leaning on Keyshawn Nixon and Nate Hobbs. And I know a lot of people will say, the retort will be, they played without Jaire for much of the last 2 years. Again, 14 combined games the last 2 years. And so the retort will be, they played without him the last 2 years. Keyshawn Nixon was fine, right? Carrington Valentine in a starter's role was good. Like, all that. You bring in Nate Hobbs now from Las Vegas over in free agency. And so the retort will be like this. Green Bay is not entering foreign territory by releasing Jaire Alexander. They've had to play without him for long, long stretches and long stints of the season. 2 years in a row and 3 of the last 4. My point being is it looks a lot healthier and a lot better with him in the room than out of it because, even with Keyshawn Nixon as your number 1 corner last year when Jaire was down, the injury Jaire had, you didn't know if he was going to be back 1 week or not, and Keyshawn was holding down the fort. But in the back of your mind, you're always telling yourself, like, man, and it never happened, but you're telling yourself, hey, Jaire's still here. Like, hopefully he can come back at some point. Now that's just gone. So that's not like a resource. That's not an option you can turn to or lean back on if you're Keyshawn Nixon, Jeff Hafley, and Green Bay. That's why I'm saying now there's more on the shoulders of those top 2 guys, Nixon and Hobbs, to show that they can be a formidable, really good 1-2 punch at corner. So we'll see. I trust Jeff Hafley. He puts guys in advantageous situations, spots for them to succeed. I love Keyshawn Nixon. He's an absolute dog. I like the addition of Nate Hobbs. I just would have preferred Jaire Alexander remain in Green Bay. I get it, but it's a tougher pill to swallow knowing that financially they could have done it, and it wouldn't have, you wouldn't have had to move mountains to do so. Not even close to it. Now, if you want to flip it over, though, and look at the positives, a lot of these guys that are in the final year of their deals, a lot of them for Green Bay, and I'm sure many of them you want to see stick around for the next 3, 4, 5 years. Open up some of those lines of communication and maybe hash out some extensions this offseason before guys hit free agency like Quay Walker, Dobbs, Christian Watson, Wyatt I mentioned has 2 years left because his 5th-year option was exercised. I think Zach Tom's probably priority number 1, but we'll see. Yeah, certainly not like a celebratory day. I don't think any Packer fans are like, yeah, thank God Jaire Alexander's gone. I think it's like, man, if he could have stayed healthy, what could have been, right? I just thought the risk was still worth it this year. I thought the risk, because again, financially, it wasn't going to mess you up. Realizing, and I like Green Bay offering a restructure. I had no problem with that. For a team that, again, is trying to compete for championships now, Jaire could have been a big chess piece on the board for you, and now he's gone. So now you're leaning on Nixon and Hobbs to really take over. Let me know what you guys think. Always, always, always appreciative of all the support. It is Mitch Heim on YouTube. Click the subscribe button. We're trying to build it up. We're doing a good job. Slow and steady wins the race. We'll see you next time.